Cultural History Community Interest Company was formed in 2018, and our objective is to provide benefit to people interested in the cultural history of their neighbourhoods and families, particularly but not exclusively in Luton. Our first 4 projects were all inspired by the centenary of the 1919 Luton peace riots, which resulted in the local community burning down the town hall. We commissioned 4 projects: an oral history project, which included republishing the book Where They Burnt Down the Town Hall, a music project, a schools project, and an art installation. The oral history project. Here we captured 12 family stories from people who had a connection to the peace riots, all of which can be heard on our website at www.culturalhistories.org. We republished the authoritative historical work telling the story of the peace riots, Where They Burnt Down the Town Hall, written by local historian Dave Craddock. The book design was completed by 2 students from the School of Art and Design at the University of Bedfordshire. The school project consisted of developing with the Chiltern Learning Trust classroom learning material on the concept of citizenship using the story of the peace riots. The art installation project, working with the School of Art and Design of the University of Bedfordshire and Bushmead Primary School, an art installation was created with a theme of protest around climate change. The music project. We commissioned a song telling the story of the peace riots. The song, We're a Jolly Lot of Fellows, was learnt and performed by 800 Luton school children. In this video, the words are spoken by the composer Richard Sisson. The children are singing the chorus. The photos are taken from the book Where They Burnt Down the Town Hall.
The Peace Day Riots in Luton, July 1919. Somebody somewhere knows the what, the who, the when, the why, the how it all kicked off that rainy weekend in July. A peace day, nationwide, was planned to honour those across the land, loyal men who'd sworn an oath to serve, to fight, to die. A joyful celebration after 4 long years of war, a time to hymn the heroes, heal the wounds so red and raw. But here in Luton, what went wrong? Voices proud weren't raised in song. Let us ask some questions, we have to find out more. How decent men who'd served the cause, unflinching, brave and bold, a generation's valour pledged and then for poppies sold. From crowd to mob that night were turned. A torch was lit, the town hall burned. 100 years have passed, and yet the stories must be told. Don't forget to remember, as the pages of history turn. Don't forget to remember, or none of us ever will learn. Somebody somewhere knows the truth and where to lay the blame. For history to be satisfied, it helps to have a name. But hindsight shows it isn't fair to single out the hapless mayor. It wasn't him alone behind this sorry day of shame. The council played their doubtful part, so too the stern town clerk. A service for ex-soldiers rashly banned in Wardown Park. And those men too were so divided, who should march quite undecided. Protestations, doubts and fears on history made their mark. A children's medal would be struck. A presentation made to those who, orphaned by the war, might march in the parade. But when the date was rearranged, these plans were ditched, the schedule changed, the youngsters left abandoned, and a nation's debt unpaid. Don't forget to remember, as the pages of history turn. Don't forget to remember, or none of us ever will learn. The war might have been over, the bruising battle won, Tommies home as heroes having thrashed the dreaded Hun. But life demobbed was hard, unjust. Men couldn't earn an honest crust. Being back in Blighty, broke, was not exactly fun. Supplies of food were rationed. For the poor, queues down the street, there was talk of profiteering by an upper-class elite. In the larder, empty shelves. Families couldn't feed themselves. A mayor's feast for Peace Day, then, at best was bittersweet. No surprise around the town, an air of bleak disquiet, such thoughtless public flaunting of the greedy rich man's diet. Ration books were set alight, burning brightly through the night, flaming coupons all ablaze, fueling the riot. If you want to find old Impey, I know where he is, I know where he is, I know where he is. If you want to find old Impey, I know where he is. He's hanging on the old town hall. I've seen him, hanging on the old town hall. Somebody somewhere threw the first stone. Somebody made a first stand. Who was the lawless someone who found that first brick in their hand? All along George Street, windows were smashed. Firemen were threatened. Their hoses were slashed. At least in the carnage, nobody died as the flames of defiance were fanned. The garage, Hart's Motors, for petrol was raided as trouble began to unfold. Pianos from Music Shop, Farmer & Co. onto rubble-strewn pavements were rolled. Umbrellas, some perfume, odd slippers, a book. These were the spoils the rioters took, looting and fighting and bawling out songs as the worst of the chaos took hold. Soldiers brave returning, lives on hold and no one earning, passions high and unrest churning. Town officials still not learning kept those home fires stoked and burning. The town's public clock, in a shower of sparks, struck its last midnight and fell. In honour of lives lost in earlier wars, no longer would sound that proud bell. And how, in the midst of this dire, joyless strife, how can we search out some lesson for life, when here in our town records tell that this was a night of fire, brimstone and hell? Don't forget to remember as the pages of history turn. Don't forget to remember, or none of us ever will learn. Don't forget to remember, in the past our tomorrows are set. Don't forget to remember. Remember not to forget.
The Historic Building Project. Here we researched 3 Luton buildings, each with a varied history, and captured family stories from local people with a connection. Working with local primary schools, we have used the research and the recorded interviews to introduce Luton's heritage to a new generation of young Lutonians. The buildings were the Gurdwara in Cardigan Street, the Islamic Centre at 116 Bury Park Road, and Chapel Langley School. Now listen to some of the interviews. Firstly, let's introduce Mrs. Ros Scott and her memories of going to the cinema in Bury Park Road in the 1930s.
My name is Ros Scott, and I was born in Luton, Hampton Road, 1920. When I'm 100 years old, it was a long time ago, very long time. And I think it was my eldest sister that was 10 years older than me who took me to the cinema. And I saw Laurel and Hardy. And I can't remember the name of the film, but I know there was a train going along, and I think Laurel and Hardy fell off, which we thought was funny as children. And he's running after the train, the fat one, Laurel, with his shirt hanging out, trying to hang on to this train. And we were all roaring with laughter in the cinema. And then the other one that I can remember, I can't remember quite what the film was about, was Charlie Chaplin. And he had suede feet with big shoes, and he always carried a rolled up umbrella which he twiddled on his hand. You know, the thing then, Charlie Chaplin, and it was black and white, no talking. It was all just funny actions which we laughed at and thought was great. and it was a real treat. You've got to remember we were dealing with farthings then, farthings and halfpennies and pennies, so I wouldn't think it was more than about tuppence. And we had to sit at the front, and when the interval came and the lights come up, if the astrolette wasn't looking, we would creep back in the other seats, otherwise you would sit with your face like that.
I'm an elder of the Luton Jewish community. There are two elders, the other one's older than me. So I've got a lot of connections with Luton Synagogue, Luton Hebrew congregation, and particularly with the building that used to be the synagogue at 116 Bury Park Road. When the Second World War started, a lot of people were evacuated, moved out from the big cities, particularly London, and a lot of them finished up in Luton. So that the number of people in Luton went from 25 families to about 2,000 people, 2,000 Jewish people in Luton. The result was that the decision was made at the end of the war to look for a bigger building. And in 1949, the Empire Cinema at 116 Bury Park Road was purchased, and work was done to convert it. It wasn't actually opened until 1953, nearly 4 years later. And by that time, a lot of the people who had moved out from London and other places because of the Second World War had actually gone and were no longer in the town. So there were about 200 people. The building had been a cinema since the 1920s and actually had quite an interesting history. So, for instance, there's a picture of the inside of the cinema, and before it was a cinema, it had been a factory, the Dynamo Propeller Factory. But there's a picture of the inside of the cinema, and there's also a picture where they were showing a Tarzan film, and to publicize it, they borrowed an elephant and walked the elephant down the road outside the cinema, and there's a picture of the elephant outside the cinema. Over a period of time, the number of Jewish people living in Luton reduced, so that there weren't 200 anymore. There were then, by the year 2000, there were only about 130 or 140 Jewish people. And the synagogue was too big. So in 2000, we sold, just after 2000, the year 2000, we sold the building and it became the Islamic Cultural Centre, which was a good use for it, continued the religious use. And that was the end of our connection with 116 Bury Park Road. It had been a very successful connection from 1949, when it was purchased, to the year 2000, when it was sold. And so over 50 years of use, and it served the Jewish people in Luton very, very well.
Now, let's listen to Shirley Hobbs talking about her time and her mother's time at Chapel Langley School. And then finally to Billy Schwer, who used the school as a training gym before he became world boxing champion.
Everybody. My name is Shirley Hobbs, and I'm going to tell you something about what it was like when I was at school. Now, I was at school a very long time ago, because I'm already a grandma, So you've got to imagine your grandma's being at school. And I went to the Chapel Street School, and it's funny because I lived in Hillborough Road, and I think your school is in Hillborough, isn't it? I lived straight opposite where the school is now. But when I lived in Hillborough Road, there wasn't a school there. It was a playing field where the boys used to come up and play football there. And so because I lived at the top of Hillborough Road, I had to walk down the road and down Russell Street to the school at the bottom, which is Chapel Street School. And so I started at that school, at Chapel Street School, in the infant side of the school, which is still there, on the corner of Russell Street and Farley Hill. And I went into there when I was 5 years old. The sort of things we did, we all sat in a row, we sat in the same room, the classroom. We didn't go to other classes for any lessons. But what we did do was go outside in the playground. In the classroom, well, we had some of the lessons that you would have now, but very different, because we had to sit at our desks, all in rows, and then teacher would teach from the front. And it was a funny room as well. I'll tell you this that you might like to know. Didn't have central heating. We had a great big fireplace. Don't know whether you can understand that, but there's a big fireplace at the front where the teacher stood. So she stood with her back to this big fireplace. She was warm and the rest of us were cold. And we had reading and writing and sums. Didn't call it arithmetic then because we're only little right now. And we did these sums. And I'm going to show you it. Well, all our writing was done by pencil only, lead pencils made of wood, a bit like this. We didn't have pens or ink because they thought that we were too little to use ink. But I know we did when I got older, but not in this infant school. And we also had crayons to colour, and there's some of the crayons there to do our colouring. So they did allow us to do some colouring. Yeah. So it's nice to know that my mum also went to that school. So we're now talking of such a long time ago, nearly 100 years ago, when my mum went to that school. She lives in the town centre. And when I was looking for my stuff about the school, now she was a bit older than me when she was there, but this is one of her books that I found with her writing in. So this wouldn't be an infant school, this would be, and she had to do her spelling lessons, and this is some of her writing of her words she had to spell. Oh, that was in ink. You can tell that's ink writing, and it says on the front, from the borough of Luton. That was the people who owned the school then, the council, which is another word for the council. And it looks to me as though it was one big book that a teacher had cut in strips like this, so each child could have a book of their own. The teacher wasn't very pleased with my mum's writing, so she put here, I do not like this form of writing. I think that's what she put. I do not like this style of writing, but it looks very good to me.
Hello, my name is Billy Schwer and I'm the former British, Commonwealth, European and World Boxing Champion. So my question to you is, would you like to be a world champion? Would you like to be world class? Us people from Luton, we're all world class. Now, I was born in Luton many, many years ago, and I love Luton. And what makes Luton very, very special are its people. So I'm very proud to say that I'm Luton Town. Everywhere I go all around the world, I talk about Luton Town and the people in it. So my relationship to Chapel Street Nursery goes right back to 1986 when I walked into the boxing gym when I was around about 17 years of age, and I started to learn how to box as a professional boxer in Chapel Street Nursery. If you can imagine, one of the rooms was a boxing gym, and all the other rooms and the other buildings were a school. So it's quite surreal. It's quite different. So I became a world champion working from this little gym in the back of a school. So it was an amazing experience. I love Chapel Street Nursery. I've got great memories of it.
Story of the Luton Hat industry as told by people who worked in it. Philip Wright, a current hat factory owner, which is still operating. Andrew Olney and Howard Hudson, former factory owners. And Val Davey, who worked in a local hat factory. The Luton hat industry had its origins in the 1600s, grew and expanded, and by the 1900s it was estimated that Luton had 1,000 factories in the town. By the 1940s, Luton was making 50 million hats a year, which were sold all over the world. The 1950s and 60s saw the beginning of decline due to changes in fashion and competition from abroad. Now there are just 3 operating hat factories in Luton. People from all over the United Kingdom and the world came to Luton and worked in the hat industry.
My name's Philip Wright. I run my family firm, Walter Wright.
The founders of the company, Walter Wright and Minnie Susan, his wife, first opened their doors 2 hours after their wedding
In 1889 at our current address, 29 Albion Road, Luton. Picture is of the Wright family. The adults in the middle sitting down are my grandparents, Walter Philip Wright and Minnie Susan. The children in that picture, they all went on to manage or run or own hat factories in Luton, to the extent that each week there was a competition, if you like, between the 7 hat factories to see who could produce the first 1,000th dozen of the week. So that's 12,000 hats per factory, times 7 per week. And it was the factory that my grandfather ran, which is the one I bought from my father in '99. It was that factory that usually won the prize each week.
My name's Andrew Olney. I was formerly the managing director of a company called Olney Headwear Limited, who were located in the Old Bedford Road area of Luton. We're a family business of hat manufacturers. My brother David, myself, are the 4th generation of the Olney family to manufacture hats in Luton. We arrived in Luton in 1922 after the company was formed in 1914 in St Albans. The family then moved to Luton where the hat trade was growing. We moved to a factory in the Hightown area of Luton in York Street because it was very accessible to the station. So we needed the transport links in the early 20s because obviously things like the M1 didn't exist. So we started manufacturing in York Street and continued there until 1976 when Luton Council in their wisdom decided to compulsory purchase our factory, and with sufficient funds we were able to purchase our current factory, or as was our current factory, in the Old Bedford Road.
My name's Howard Hudson. I'm 76 years of age. I was born in Luton in 1944, and I grew up in Luton, and I worked in the hat trade all of my life until I left Luton in 2012. So in 1902, he and my grandmother decided to start manufacturing. My grandmother was very artistic and she was able to do the design. My grandfather had knowledge of manufacture, and also his great knowledge was in plaits, in grading plaits and knowing what sort of plaits would work for certain things. So they started the business and that was known as Daniel Burgess Millinery. And my mother, again, was a designer. She was born in 1908. She worked with her parents. Was in 1941, mother decided that she would go into the model end and became C.M. Hudson Model Millinery. Mother had her factory in Princess Street, in Hastings Street, had a factory at the back of the house. So the dwellings were at the front of the property, and then at the rear of the property was a small factory.
My name is Valerie Davey. When I was younger, I went to Canterbury and trained in the millinery for making hats. And when I finished my 3-year course, I went to London to work in the hat factory. And then I actually went to work in another hat factory in Luton. The hat factory that I worked in was called Morris Davis. It was in Guildford Street. And I was taken on, employed as being the supervisor of the workroom and the designer. And while I was in the hat factory, my job was to look after the team of workers in the room. Some of them were machinists, some of them were using glue guns. And also I had to do the outdoor work. I had to make all the boxes up and put all the work in and all the fabric that would be sent out to our outdoor workers. It's where the companies send you work in boxes. You have about 6 or more boxes, and inside those boxes there is a hat that you have to follow, a design, and then you hand sew to do the hats. It's all hand sewn. Everything is there in the box for you, and when you finished it, you put it back in the boxes, and they come along and pick it up, and it goes to the factory.
Obviously, nothing stays the same. Interest in hats, therefore, started to wane. In the 1950s, ladies still wouldn't walk outside their house without wearing a hat. But over a period of generations, and fashion goes round, it might be popular, but then it will decline. So fashion comes around, but the non-wearing of hats stayed. So less hats were worn, less demand. We, as a factory, we evolved with that. We got smaller. My great-grandmother employed 1,000 staff more. My great-grandfather, he would have employed about 800. My father employed about 400. I employed, my busiest time, I employed 35, which is a much smaller amount of people.
We carried on into the 50s and 60s making blocked hats. It then started to decline later on in the 60s, and we then had to develop our uniform business. But we would still source all the materials ourselves. So all the materials we would source from around the world. So for example, our Panama hats that we used to block in Luton were hand woven in Ecuador in the early 90s, as shops then became very driven by costs. And so we were then really hit hard by the fact that buyers would come in and the first thing they would ask is how much is your hat? It changed, and we had to change with it. So we made sure that our hats and caps were of the highest quality. We used the best materials that we could get. And we never took shortcuts. It was always very important that every one of our caps and hats made was of the same standard. So we were very, very strict on our quality. And then into the sort of 2000s, we started to make tweed caps, and that was then picked up by the production team for the television series Peaky Blinders. That got the cap very famous. Which started actually developing our internet business. In the early 80s, we eventually built the workforce up to some 70 staff. Unfortunately, the problem we then encountered was an economic one, and we were then up against other companies in the town. Obviously, in the hat trade, there were 1 or 2 companies that were of a similar size to ourselves. So there was competition for wages and salaries in that way. But Our biggest competition came from the sort of multinational companies, so the Vauxhall Motors, the airport, as it started to grow in the late 80s, early 90s, and they were paying a lot more than it was economically viable for the hat trade to be able to afford or to pay. And that was when we started really seeing a skill shortage, which eventually with the, you know, with the push on prices and the amount we could charge for our headwear, led us to diversifying and moving some of our bulkier production abroad. And this we did by moving production firstly to the Czech Republic, and then eventually to Poland, and some to China, which again allowed us in Luton to concentrate on the highly skilled, more expensive headwear.
Fortunately, probably, a company in Ireland, a couple of guys from Balbriggan, just outside of Dublin, had rung me up and asked me whether or not they'd heard that I had some knowledge, and would I go out to China and set up a production plant for them out in China, which I did. A little bit against my disgust, because I felt that the trade that I'd known and had given me a very good living all my life, being a managing director of two companies, I thought, well, I'm now taking all that knowledge and giving it to somebody else who was really our direct competitor. They said, would I go out to China? And I did just that. We started off with a factory in Suzhou, well, in Shanghai to start with. Then we went to Suzhou and then down into Gucci. And I did that until 2012. From my experience in China, I could quite easily see why the Chinese were able to produce their products so cheaply and became so competitive. It was a great shame that we had to lose it, but that was as it was.
In sort of 2015, 2016, with the idea that we would then move out of our very large factory in Old Bedford Road. The plan was to relocate to the outskirts of the town with our small number of dedicated staff, so that we could then have a smaller production facility and keep our costs down. Unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic, or the start of the pandemic, non-essential retail virtually closed down overnight. If it wasn't for our very strong online presence and our internet sales, I think it probably would have completely forced us out of business. And really, this with the change in retail from retail to online sales sort of was the straw that broke the camel's back, basically. And we were forced into a decision that in 2019 we would actually close the business down and not relocate, which was a great shame after 105, 106 years.
It hasn't changed. We use the same machinery. We have a few more tricks up our sleeve on how to make stuff, but essentially the machinery, the methodology, the handwork, it's all the same. How do you make a hat? You've got to make it by hand, and it ain't broke, so we don't mend it. No. So yeah, the hat trade declined. So from 1,000 hat factories in the early 1900s, 1,000 hat factories in Luton, that has now become 3. We are very much a disappearing craft. What can you do in a country that is beginning to enjoy the fun of hats again, but now the volume of hats that would be considered an industry, that volume is no longer made in England. And despite whatever some people hope or think that industry can return to the country, it's the knowledge, a knowledge that has been built up over hundreds of years, that has been handed down to the next generation. That knowledge isn't written in a book. It is by word of mouth, by doing, by seeing, by observing, by copying. And those people, they're gone. So the knowledge of how to make them, not just hats, anything, it would be difficult for industry just to suddenly come back to this country, because there's no one actually now who knows how to do it. So that's fine. It's what it is. We are proud of what we have done. We're proud of what we do. And we might probably be missed in years to come.
Don't forget to remember as the pages of history turn. Don't forget to remember, or none of us ever will learn. Don't forget to remember, in the past our tomorrows are set. Don't forget to remember. Remember not to forget.